In this lesson, we'll take a look at the female reproductive cycle. So we're going to divide the reproductive cycle into two parts. The first part is the ovarian cycle, right? These are going to be the changes that take place in the ovaries. And then the uterine cycle are going to be the changes that take place in the uterus as a result of the ovarian cycle. Some people do call, or actually probably most people call the uterine cycle the menstrual cycle, right? You probably hear that a little bit more. So we're going to take the changes that are taking place specifically in the endometrium, right? The myometrium and the perimetrium, they're pretty constant. It's going to be that the functional layer of the endometrium that's going to undergo most of the changes. Before we look at those two cycles, let's just review some of the hormones that are important to reproduction in the female. So the first one is a hormone that's produced by the hypothalamus. And if you remember from the endocrine system, the hypothalamus regulates a lot of the endocrine system, specifically the pituitary gland below. And it's this gonadotropin releasing hormone basically is telling the pituitary when to release its hormones. Some of the hormones that are released by the pituitary include FSH, which is the follicle stimulating hormone. This would be the hormone that causes a follicle to mature and become eventually a mature follicle or a Graafian follicle. Right? So each month we're going to see that the follicle stimulating hormone initiates follicular growth. The second hormone that comes from the anterior pituitary is luteinizing hormone that ultimately is going to result in ovulation, right? So we're going to see on a 28-day cycle, on day 14, there's a surge of luteinizing hormone that's going to result in ovulation. Some other hormones, estrogen, right? So it's actually not just one hormone. There's actually 6 different types of estrogen have been identified. 3 of them are in pretty much high amounts. So the most common estrogen is known as beta estradiol. This is the most abundant. There's also estrone and estriol. These are just other types of estrogen. What estrogen does is it helps to promote female secondary sex characteristics. It strengthens bones and it even lowers cholesterols. Now, progesterone to me is one of the important hormones of pregnancy. So we're going to see it's produced by these cells that are in the ovary after ovulation, known as the corpus luteum, and it's basically thickening up the endometrium for implantation. If fertilization does take place, right, we have to have a nice thick uterus, uterine lining to have implantation. Another hormone produced by the corpus luteum is relaxin. Right, so this is produced by the corpus luteum, and basically it's going to inhibit contractions of the myometrium. Right, think about that. If you have the myometrium contracting, implantation may not take place. It also works during pregnancy. During pregnancy, the placenta produces a large amount of relaxin, which increases the flexibility of the pubic symphysis and helps to dilate the cervix. Right? So it just makes the pelvis a little bit, looser, if you will, to help open up that pelvic outlet. Now, another hormone is called inhibin. If you think about this, during pregnancy, we don't really need to have a follicle become mature each month. We don't need ovulation, right? So we don't really need LH. So inhibin tells the pituitary, you know what, stop producing FSH, stop producing LH, right? Because we're already pregnant. Okay, so let's take a look at the actual phases of the female reproductive cycle. What I did was this. I'll have the name of the phase, and then I put down the events that take place in the ovary, and then we'll see what changes take place in the uterus. Okay, so everything begins in what we call the menstrual phase. This is basically the first 5 days of the cycle. Now, in the ovary, what's happening under the influence of FSH from the anterior pituitary, Several of those primordial follicles start to mature and develop into primary follicles and then eventually secondary follicles. All right, so this is happening in the ovary as a result of this FSH coming down from the anterior pituitary. In the uterus, since this is the menstrual phase, what we're going to see is menstrual flow. Right? There'll actually be bleeding, so there'll be blood, some tissue fluid, some mucus, epithelial cells, all shed from the endometrium, specifically the functional layer. Remember, the endometrium has two layers, a functional layer and a basal layer. So it's this functional layer that's being lost. The reason this happened, guys, is because there was declining levels of progesterone and estrogen from the previous month, and that caused the spiral arteries inside the functional zone to actually become constricted and narrow and not supply blood to this layer of the endometrium, and as a result it's going to slough off. Right, this is the functional layer. We can call it the stratum functionalis or functional layer. It's the same thing. Okay, so during the first 5 days, again, we have the maturation of the follicles into a secondary follicle in the ovary, and in the uterus we actually have the menstrual flow. The next phase is from day 16 to day 6 to day 13. We're going to pick up where menstruation left off. So this lasts from day 6 to day 13. This is the period of time between menstruation and ovulation. So let's take a look at what's happening in the ovary first. Remember, from the previous phase, we had secondary follicles. So these secondary follicles begin to secrete a bunch of estrogens and the inhibin. Again, the estrogens we're going to see are important to rebuild the uterine lining. By day 6, a single secondary follicle has outgrown the others to become the more dominant follicle. And again, that dominant follicle we're going to call the mature follicle or the Graafian follicle. Remember, when you look at the Graafian follicle under the microscope, that's the follicle that has the water, the antrum, where you can see the actual clear fluid. The Graafian follicle also cranks out estrogen. So in the uterus, the estrogen that's coming from the mature follicle and the secondary follicle are basically repairing the endometrium, right? They're starting to rebuild the endometrium that had been lost in the previous month, right? So the cells of the stratum basalis, the basal layer, undergo mitosis, and watch this, they create a new stratum functionalis or functional layer, right? So we're starting to rebuild that uterine lining. Hence the name. I actually like this, proliferative phase, right? Proliferative means to proliferate, to build up something. Okay, so that takes us into day 13. On a 28-day cycle, we're now halfway through the month. On day 4, there's going to be a rupture of that mature follicle, and the oocyte, right, which is a secondary oocyte, it's suspended in meiosis too, is ejected into the pelvic cavity. I didn't put it here, but if you want to add it, this results as a surge of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Right, so this luteinizing hormone, this spike in LH, results in ovulation. So now, from the ovulation, we're now going to go into the second half of the month, right? The second half of the month is day 15 to day 28, right? So this is the time between ovulation and the onset of the next menses, if conception didn't take place. In the female reproductive cycle, this is the most constant part of a reproductive cycle. Right, not every female is going to have a perfect 28-day cycle. Right? Some are shorter, some are longer, but this second half of the month is the most consistent. So let's take a look at the events in the ovary first. So we had left off on day 14. there was ovulation. So the mature follicle that remains, right, the oocyte has been ejected, the mature follicle that remains will collapse, and there's some minor bleeding, and the follicle will form a little bit of a blood clot. They refer to that follicle during this time the corpus hemorrhagicum, right? Again, you can kind of guess hemorrhagicum has to do with the bleeding. Eventually that corpus hemorrhagicum is going to become something that most people know as the yellow body or the corpus luteum. This corpus luteum is so important. It's going to crank out progesterone, estrogen, relaxin, and inhibin. And we'll see why this is important in a second. If no fertilization takes place, right? No sperm were present, no fertilization takes place, the corpus luteum will stay viable for about 2 weeks. And eventually it'll stop working and it's going to become a white body known as the corpus albicans. So it just kind of degenerates and, you know, becomes nothing. We're going to call that the corpus albicans. And this is going to stop producing hormones. However, if fertilization did take place, the embryo, which are the new cells that are developing, produces a hormone known as HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. And this is basically the embryo, right, the new baby, telling the corpus luteum, I'm here, keep producing the hormones of pregnancy, and it stimulates the corpus luteum to continue secreting the hormones. This corpus luteum is basically going to stay viable until the placenta forms. That's how important the corpus luteum is. Okay, so again, the main things that's happening in this phase here, this corpus luteum, again, if no fertilization takes place, it's going to disappear over 2 weeks and become the corpus albicans, and this is going to stop producing hormones, which is going to bring us to the next month. If fertilization takes place, the embryo is going to produce the HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, and that's going to be the signal for the corpus luteum to continue working and maintain the pregnancy until a placenta is formed. So, in the uterus, the estrogens and the progesterone that are being cranked out by the corpus luteum are promoting growth and coiling of the glands, right? The glands become nice and healthy. The tissue of the endometrium becomes more vascular and it starts to thicken. If fertilization does not occur, the levels of progesterone and estrogens decline, again, resulting in menstruation. And that's where, if I go back a slide, that's right over here. This corpus albicans, or if we get to this stage, is going to result in here low levels of progesterone and estrogen, and that now brings us into the next month, and we're back into menstruation, and it starts all over again. Okay, so those are the phases of the female reproductive cycle. Again, if you kind of keep the ovary and the uterus a little bit separate, and you see what the ovary is doing, the uterus responds to the ovarian changes by the various hormones.